Imagine you are at an academic conference and somebody says to you, oh, you study media in the Arab world? I'm not familiar with that. All I know is that there's no freedom of speech, that speech is highly, highly, highly regulated. Do you think it's a oversimplification? Is it missing the point entirely? Or is it something that is absolutely true and we just never really talk about it?
I think it's all of the above. It's a very complicated feeling, right?
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Marwan Kraidy, who is the Dean and a Professor at Northwestern in Qatar. Welcome, Marwan.
Thank you, Mikey, for inviting me.
It's really fun having you on here. I'm a big fan of Northwestern, Northwestern in Qatar. So for the uninitiated, it's an interesting sort of model. So tell us just a little bit about what Northwestern in Qatar focuses on and what you guys do so that we can sort of set the stage for the broader conversation.
So Northwestern University in Qatar is one of a group of U.S. universities that were invited to Doha by the Qatar Foundation to set up curricula, each in its own areas of strength. And so for us, Northwestern is famous, among other things, in journalism and communication, so that's what we do. So we're the media school in Qatar Foundation's Education City. We offer degrees in journalism, strategic communication, and then we have a very thriving liberal arts program that supports those.
And for avid listeners, we had a professor from Northwestern on the series recently talking about Palestine. Okay, so I want to talk to you about many things, but I kind of want to start by talking about one of your older books, okay? Which is, let me get the name exactly right, Reality Television and Arab Politics, which came out in 2010, over 10 years ago. I think 2010, right? If you were to speak to the guy who wrote that book over a decade ago and give him a general update on what happened to the media landscape in the Arab world over the last 10 days and how that has shaped society, what would you say to that guy?
I would say go back on your spaceship and fly a few light years away. No, seriously, look, I think what I would say is at the time I wrote the book, people still had illusions that the media mainly construct or mainly reflected the truth or not. I think nowadays, after multiple waves of crises in what we think of as truth or knowledge or fact, even your average mobile phone user, because most people now don't have the box or the large screen we used to call TV back then, right, are much more sophisticated. Sophisticated in a very blasé, very cynical kind of way, I'm afraid.
Aside from the effect or the sort of the mode of acquisition or the mode of exposure to media, how do you think media itself has changed? I mean, the reason why I'm framing it within the context of that book is because the first two words in the title of that book are reality television, which are kind of a term that is really a prisoner of that moment. Reality, like we don't use that term anymore, reality television, because almost all of media is reality television.
Yes,
now.
So it's definitely caught in the moment. It's caught in the moment when television worldwide was sort of in the second phase post national or state TV. And there was an exploration based on these few formats that basically you could make a lot more money by inviting neophytes, amateurs, non-professionals, and create social experiments with them that you capture on camera. I mean, the way you nailed it by saying it's a prisoner of the moment. So, I was just thinking when you asked me. So imagine that in 2008, it was very controversial for a lot of people in the region that a group of 14 or 15 young people live in a studio in Dubai or Bahrain or Beirut, right? And that a camera is capturing moments of dancing or flirting or eating together. If you think of now, every teenager with a phone is doing this on TikTok.
Exactly.
Right. So the transformation is absolutely drastic. Right. The central model, even back then, when people were saying, "Oh, television is no longer broadcasting sort of a central power of communicating to the masses, but rather it's becoming interactive, it's becoming back and forth, so on and so forth." Look at it now. It's a completely fragmented landscape. Every person with a cell phone is a media creator. This is momentous, right? In good and in bad ways.
It's interesting because like your scholarship seems to focus on media's effect on society, social change, activism. I wonder if you feel like these changes in technology and in media are creating a more engaged public in the Arab world or a less engaged public in the Arab world.
You know, that's a $1 million question, right? In the sense that, first, the premise, is it the gadgetry that is creating something, that's creating more apathy or more engagement, or is it rather a different kind of process, right? Because you also have a kind of social political maturity that goes along with technological change that's not always determined by it. So what we can say for a fact is that the landscape now is much more fragmented, right? It's much more difficult to mobilize large publics for causes for the common good. So almost every public now is a niche public, with a couple of exceptions, and those tend to be not so attractive, which is, you know, the sort of hyper-nationalism, whether it's religious or more sort of ethnic based, that we see online in places like India, among others, or the sort of racist white supremacy movements that we see, or their equivalent, any kind of fascist movement around the world. Unfortunately, one of the interesting things with social media is the affective charge of trying to create a public, or the affective charge that creates a public, has gotten a lot stronger and a lot less predictable, right?
Say that again. The affective charge that creates a public. What do you mean by that?
The affective charge,
the
right?
Affective
The social media has allowed individuals and groups to manipulate, convey, amplify the kinds of emotions that the old propagandists of the days of television and cinema can only dream about. Right?
Yeah.
And so in that regard, I think it's both fragmented, it tends to the extremes. At the same time, there are all kinds of developments with social media where it's just very hard to come down on one side. Is it good or is it bad? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, academics by definition like to complicate things. But in this situation, it's clearly a black box. It depends on who's asking what questions about what community using what medium.
But the Marwan of 10, 15 years ago, was he an optimist? Was he saying, oh my God, this is a force for good? The Arab world is going to fundamentally change. We're entering into the Arab Spring. It's very much a Twitter revolution, Facebook revolution, and this is going to open up new possibilities for civic engagement and create a more just and equitable society. And now the new Marwan is like, whoops.
So here's the thing, right? So when I wrote the book, when I finished writing the reality TV book, I finished it in September 2008, right? And so the Arab Spring was relatively far away. I was an optimist, but I'm not a utopian about technology, right? I always feel there's too much hype about technology. I was a party pooper among media and communication scholars in 2011, 2012 about the Arab Spring, right? And then, of course, when ISIS came along a few years later and started using social media in a very different kind of way, a lot of people took pause, right? So it's not about what technology can do. It's about a kind of articulation of a place, of an agenda, of a community, and of a technology. So one of the interesting things about, the independence intifada in Beirut, which some people recast the Cedar Revolution because of their own sort of discursive preferences, right? That was the age of blogging. That was before social media had any kind of wide impact. Yeah. Social media, Facebook and Twitter were at a very experimental stage in those years and very limited availability, right? What I thought was interesting was the combination of cellular phones back then, mobile phones, and blogs, right? And the idea was that mobile phones could send pictures and videos, which was the early day of mobile phone video, to blogs that were nonetheless still not conceived of as mobile media, right? It was still more of this is a digital version of a book or a diary of a newspaper. So that's only like 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And that itself is amazing. So the general gist of how I look at these things is always look at the people first and at the technology second, right? Gadgets, technologies, platforms only become popular if there's a need. Sometimes there's an unknown need. If they scratch an itch, they become popular. If not, they don't, right? We have a cemetery of platforms and gadgets and media that just didn't go anywhere. So I think we have to be very careful in not somehow ascribing too much power to technology. Technology is fundamentally important, but technology is always manipulated, amplified, constrained, and deployed by people.
There's that old adage that had to do with really books, but I think people also applied it to newspapers at the time, which is Cairo writes, Beirut prints, and Baghdad reads.
Yes.
And it really spoke to sort of this triangle of the media infrastructure in the Arab world at the time. Where do you think the media sector is the strongest across the Arab world these days? Who's writing, who's reading, who's printing?
It's interesting because we're using writing, reading, and printing as a metaphor, right? Because we're looking books, newspapers, and all that. Look, it's not controversial to anyone to say that the center of gravity for media in the region has moved to the Gulf, right? And if you look at Arab media in general as very basically defined as media in the Arabic language, there's no question that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are the center of gravity in the whole region. And what that does, it creates all kinds of issues, right? So it used to be what you described. Then at some point, anybody living in the region, for example, would watch the Egyptian musalsalat. Then we had Syrian musalsalat, right? Then we had reality TV was really a Lebanese-dominated genre, at least for a few years. Now, all these genres are still in existence, although, as you said, reality TV has sort of infused everything else. But a lot of the funding comes from the Gulf. A lot of the infrastructure is in the Gulf, right? And a lot of the people, the Syrians, the Palestinians, the Egyptians, the Lebanese media workers are in the Gulf, full-time or part-time.
Yeah.
So there is that, right? Who's watching? It's very difficult to really know because the how you measure, we used to call it the audience. There's no more audience. There are users now. So we go from a singular word to denote a collectivity, a large group, to words that denote one person, right? I think the issue, though, is, of course, in terms of where people sit on the social spectrum, right? A lot of people decried that the move of the center of gravity to the Gulf means media, in general, media content's becoming more socially conservative. I think there's some evidence supporting that. So there's a lot that doesn't support that, right? That's one thing. On the other hand, the Arab sphere is no longer contained like it used to be. And this is something that we need in several ways. One of them is a lot of the platforms. Yes, take Netflix as an example.
Yeah.
the great thing about Netflix, as far as I'm concerned, is I can be sitting in Doha watching Spanish content, Belgian content, American films, but also Syrian, Egyptian, Lebanese content, right? So the platformization of media means that, with some variations. In other words, if you have a Netflix account here in Doha, you can't necessarily watch. You don't have access to the same things that you have access to in the U.S. But everybody knows the magic acronym VPN, right? So you have a dilution of what we used to call Arab media in a much larger sphere. That's number one. Number two, I think, and this is something that's perhaps more typical to places like Dubai and Doha, where you have a lot of people here that I know, Arabs who I talk to, who when they come here, they start watching more Bollywood, for example. Right? Yeah. So there's this almost the success of Turkish drama, which is something I'm working on now. What does that tell you? It tells you that the categories are much more diffuse, much less defined than it used to be. People can watch anything they want, with the exception of Ramadan, where you have a concentration of people focusing on musalsalat in Arabic. It's very difficult to say that Arab viewers watch Arab content. It's not a taken for granted assumption anymore.
I want to shift the conversation slightly, but I think it will actually broaden this conversation that we're having right now, which is, what is the market mechanism that is governing the media industry in the Arab world right now? If you look at sort of mass media, the business model of mass media in centuries past, it's different than what it is now. Also, the Arab world is different than many other places because there's so much state funding and subsidized funding for this sector. And so I'm curious, you sit somewhere that gives you a purview that I don't have. What is the business model for the media industry in the Arab world right now?
So I think the most candid answer is there is none. And let me explain what I mean. It used to be, so if you think of media in general as something that delivers a message to an audience, right? And then you have the sort of the Marxist folks in the critical political economy tradition who said, no, what the media do is deliver an audience to advertisers, right? So we know that whatever spending, if you take the Arab world as a totality, advertising cannot support all the media activities we see. So that's one thing, right? So a lot of the funding is the kind of funding that seeks influence and not profit. Social influence, political influence, and not profit. As a result, it's very difficult to generalize. So, for example, a lot of the media in the Gulf are definitely supported by states, right? If you look at the media scene in Lebanon, and the closure of some newspapers and then TV channels and all that, it's precisely because if you had to look at a traditional business model where advertising supports most channels, and let's say you have Tele Liban, that's this 50-50 formula, the Lebanese market can sustain at best 2 or 3 channels, not at some point 150 or 100 or 80 or 2 dozen, right? So it's not, I wouldn't call it even a market, right? It's a sector. It's a sector where social influence, political influence matter as much as profit.
Yeah.
Now, we have a lot of new businesses developing, whether it's some of the streaming devices, a company like Anghami, all those. Those are different, but those tend to be purely on the quote-unquote entertainment side, right? Where it's much more obvious that profit, building an audience for profit, is the main raison d'etre of a business, because it's a business. It's not the case, I think, for example, for satellite TV news. Yeah. So that makes it very difficult to speak of a business model.
As somebody who studies this stuff, do you feel like at some point if they're going to compete on the global scale, as you mentioned, the sphere is opening up, right? If the center of gravity is going to be in the Gulf, then obviously once you move that center of gravity in that direction, you start to understand that that's very close to South Asia, that's very close to East Africa. You have to understand that you will begin to have to compete in those sectors as well. So do you predict that there's going to have to be some P&L gravity that emerges and some sort of business model that emerges, or maybe not?
Look, I think I in a way trying to predict this is a fool's errand, but let's use a couple of examples.
Yeah.
I do think so. In the reality TV book, when I was analyzing a couple of episodes of Star Academy, I talked about this what I called back then, I think, Global South aesthetic. So if you're watching television in Lebanon, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Miami, and in India, you'll see a lot of commonalities in the way people behave, in the way people dress, right?
And the way it's filmed.
And the way it's filmed, and absolutely, right? Which, again, I don't want to make a civilizational argument of any kind. I'm definitely not saying that. But there are interesting similarities. So this is what makes Turkish television drama so fascinating. Turkish television drama today, and that could be an illustration of what you're talking about, is a tremendous global success, right? It started in the Arab world, moved to the Balkans, you have Spain, Italy, then it moved to Latin America, started in Chile, moved to Argentina, went up to Mexico, through Mexico to Miami. So the Miami Hispanic channels show Turkish drama. Now it's big in India, in Pakistan. I mean, Ertugrul became a folk hero in Pakistan. You know, that's the father of Osman, who founded the Ottoman dynasty. The historical record has very little about him. And so you create this massive series, right, that create this myth. So why? Why? Well, partly because people all over what we call the Global South, right, which is a very nebulous term and all that, but I think it means something, are thirsty for stories that reflect them and not necessarily reflect Hollywood or European narratives. And this is where I think what you said is very important, right? The Gulf is a pivot between Africa, Asia, and Europe in many ways. There's the money, there's the infrastructure, there are the people. I mean, Doha has radio channels in at least a dozen languages, right? Yeah. And so that facilitates in these kinds of circuits of exchange. And when you have something like Turkish television drama that shows that it can be done and people can make a lot of money, I'm sure people are thinking of what's next, people in the industry.
Let's just talk about the Turkish thing for a second. For those people who are unfamiliar, when did this phenomena start?
So, I mean, it really depends on what you mean by start. So there were some exchanges in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. It really took off after 2010. Look, people differ whether it's a government thing or a private thing. I think the real complicated story is that it's both, right? Turkey was an emerging regional power economically, very active television sector, a lot of writers, a lot of authors. They started writing them. They became successful. The government felt this is a chance for us. This is an opportunity. They started funding it, and it blew up, right? But what's interesting is where it started. It didn't start in government negotiations. It started in these global media fairs where producers meet and buy these programs.
Yeah.
Right? So by the time I was writing the reality TV book, for example, 2008, that was the summer when Nur, which is Gümüş in Turkish, was basically taking over the Arab waves, right? So, and what I talked about in the conclusion of the reality TV book is that this seems to be the next thing. So reality TV is sort of over. Turkish dramas is now taking over.
Yeah.
So it started in the Arab world in 2008. Within a couple of years, it was in Latin America. And, I'm very serious about pursuing it with like where it's going. So a few years ago, I was in Argentina, sort of meeting with people, interviewing people who work in the media, journalists about the phenomenon. In Argentina, it was massive. At some point, it literally took over prime time. Right? And so why? Because it's cheaper to acquire. Aesthetically, it resembles a lot of the stuff that maybe a Latin American public is used to, with a pinch of exoticism. But there are some issues with sort of the social narratives that they portray.
Yeah.
But they went all the way to Argentina, all the way to India. That's a phenomenon.
Can we use Captain Majid as a corollary?
Yes, to some extent, but how far did Captain Majid really go?
I don't know.
Right?
It seems to be ubiquitous.
Yeah, I mean, look, so here's the interesting thing. We used to speak of these geolinguistic markets.
Yeah.
Right? So Captain Majid would circulate very widely in the Arabic
or like
geolinguistic
Grandizer,
market, right? Grandizer is unbelievable, but I'm almost a cult fan of Grandizer.
Yeah, it's insane.
I have a reading corner at home, and it's all Grandizer memorabilia, right? These popular culture is a strange thing.
Yeah.
Why does it develop the way it was? Because it makes people feel certain ways that you don't forget. Right?
Okay, so
yeah.
Keep going. Finish the thought, and I have another question.
I was just saying that we go back to how watching a story unfold, watching characters face battles, make people feel. It makes them feel in ways that they will never forget. So they will keep going back.
So if the industry is not focused on, isn't based on a business model that is exclusively dealing with dollars and cents, but instead focusing on influence, what sort of influence do you think a show like the Turkish show has?
Oh yeah.
And this, like this past year, many people are celebrating the 50 years of hip hop, right?
Yes.
And hip hop has been exported from a house party in the Bronx all over the world, and has had huge social influence, right?
Absolutely.
And has also made billionaires. I'm curious, what sort of influence does this Turkish media have on, obviously, the Arab world, but Latin America, and maybe more closer to home, what sort of influence does all of the new media being created in the Gulf, very strategically created and exported, what sort of influence are they trying to buy?
Again, influence can happen intentionally and can happen unintentionally, but it can also be like the production may not be designed to seek and secure influence, but can be instrumentalized. Let me give you a couple of examples. So when I was in Argentina, one of the people I interviewed was a very prominent journalist who was a correspondent for a major US paper. And this is what she told me. She had a 14-year-old daughter who became so enamored with Turkish drama that she joined a group of people online who, like a fan group, it started on Facebook and then migrated. It moved to a group of teenagers in Latin America who were learning the Turkish language. And within a couple of months, she was so obsessed that she convinced her parents that their next vacation should be in Turkey. So what you see in this example are I think, three things. One is an emotional involvement in a country that's 10,000 kilometers away, right? That in a way, that's shocking. That's interesting. That's influence, by the way. Second, I think a key thing to cultural influence is language. You have a teenager sitting in Buenos Aires, like an upper middle class teenager, who's learning English, who's learning Turkish, not because she's been told you'll find a good job, not because it helps you secure admission at a good university, but because she loves it. And then you have the economic impact of tourism. We do know that some of the locations depicted in some of the Turkish series have been mobbed by tourists, particularly, but not only from Arab countries.
Yeah.
From the Balkans, from Russia, right? So here you have linguistic, cultural, and economic impact in one example. Extrapolate that to everything that's being produced, right? I think in addition to all of this, I think in the Gulf, there's I lived through the World Cup in Doha. And one of the things you realize is a lot of these media investments are being deployed to counter some of the narratives about the region, right?
Sure.
So witnessing how the World Cup unfolded, looking at the media coverage of it was very revealing to me that there was clearly a campaign, right, that was just not having it that an Arab country or a Muslim country would host such an event, right? Some of the criticism were well-founded, sure, but there was a broader narrative that basically said that was on a high-level representational issue, right? Which is Arabs are this, the Gulf people are that, Muslims are this, right? The broad, they're others, they're different. But there was another element into this that I thought was fascinating that goes back to the example of Turkish drama, this sort of south-south circulation of media and culture that doesn't need to go through Europe or the US for validation, which is that if you went to Souk Waqif, for example, and I went multiple times during the World Cup, or to the fan zones, you'll see an ocean of fans from Argentina, another ocean from Brazil. In the earlier stages, there were a lot of Mexicans. And then you see a dozen Germans. And of course, I'm judging by the jerseys they're wearing.
Yeah.
Right? So in some sense, by the time the World Cup ended, of course, there were controversies. Every World Cup has controversies. It sort of showed the power of deploying these cultural resources, because sport is also a cultural resource, right?
Yeah.
That the World Cup happened, it was a success. It was, there were controversies, but it happened. Whether the publics from the West came or not, it didn't really matter.
Here's a question for you. South, I'm in.
Yeah.
I understand. I see it. I see it at play, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely I see it at play. I mean, I see it at play through afikra, right? I see the types of people who are engaging with afikra, who feel like they're part of the community, from Indonesia to Chile to all of these different places. I'm totally in. But there's an illusion that it's exclusively South, because
Always.
whoever's watching this is watching this on YouTube. Who's ever emailing me, messaging me, is messaging me through Instagram, right? There is an illusion of South because of the platforms that exist. They all go through platforms, and none of the platforms are South.
It's not just that. It's so interesting that you say this. So one of the first things that I did when I took this job here in Doha was to create this Institute for Advanced Study on the Global South.
Of course.
And I said, the Global South is not just a geography, but it's a bunch of political ideas, a bunch of intellectual traditions, so on and so forth. And people would tell me, but this is exclusive, you need to be inclusive. It excludes the West. And I said, how? Right? Exactly. So if you look at the infrastructure, the global infrastructure, it's clearly still not, quote unquote, entirely South. So people tell me, but Brazil makes airplanes. I'm like, but how many of you have traveled on an Embraer jet as opposed to a Boeing or an Airbus? Yeah. So you're absolutely right. The platforms, yes. Even the language, sometimes. I mean, here we are. We could be doing this in Arabic, but it's a different audience, right? So when I say South, I don't mean something that's exclusive. It's just a way to reframe the focus of one's thinking, which is I'm very interested in highlighting, my life project is understanding all kinds of circuitry going on between the Arab world and Latin America. That's something that I feel extremely vested in, right? Why do I find it interesting? For a variety of reasons. First of all, it's personally interesting, and that's very valid. I think second, there are experiences that remain untold, or let's say experiences that have remained unlived and stories that have remained untold, when the focus is always on immigration to the West, right? As opposed to, if you want to understand why the food we're eating tastes the way it tastes, understanding these kinds of south-to-south traffic is essential, right?
Yeah.
But also in terms of numbers, more people are included in these experiences than in the movement between, let's say, the Middle East and North America. So to me, it's really a different focus. It's a different analytical lens, and it's definitely not to say that this exists in separation of everything else.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about another book you wrote, The Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World. This also came out, it was really focused on the 2010 to 2012 moment in Cairo, as well as other places that were the sites of the quote-unquote Arab Spring.
Yes.
Again, I kind of want to do the decade retrospective.
Yeah.
What is the state of the Arab creative insurgency today?
The state of Arab creative insurgent, right now, most of them are cold because they're in Berlin and in Stockholm and in London and in New York. Many people have left. Not all. And I don't say this in any way to demean all the cultural producers that remain in the region. But this kind of creative migration has happened, right? We all know it has happened. Two, I think more than ever now they're aware of their limitations. So when I conclude the book about, basically what's the limit to this embodied type of activism? Well, illness and death and imprisonment. And unfortunately, we've seen this wave that some people have called the Arab Winter fall over the region. At the same time, you have an efflorescence of arts, of creativity in all kinds of ways, but one that is not explicitly political. I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
Right? Because explicitly political, in some countries you die, in other countries you're deported. So I think it has changed a little bit.
Do you feel like this is, when you said region, I felt a very subtle pivot, sort of discursive pivot, right? And the region you're talking about is Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Lebanon, and not the region that we were just speaking about, which is Saudi, Dubai,
yes,
Qatar.
Yep, absolutely.
Do you feel that these two regions are still connected?
Look, here's what I worry. I do think one of the main connectors actually is this creative class. And I'm not saying this to glorify it or to romanticize it, but a lot of the so-called insurgents during the Arab Springs have become sort of fully established artists now. And a lot of them work in places like Doha and Dubai and Jeddah, right?
Sure.
So here's what happens. Creative migration is always tricky because some people may never go back, right, to where they came from. But there's always this learning process where skills, traditions remain alive. So yes, they've moved, they've been displaced, but their skills are being developed, their reputations are being developed. You have entire traditions that remain. I can't help but feel hopeful about that. Have their political energies been bridled? Yes. Right? But I'd rather have artists who are developing their skills, who are becoming perhaps more sophisticated, more oblique in how they do politics, rather than having them rot in jail cells.
What do you remember about those years? I mean, when you're writing this book, what is the sort of persistent memory? What is the flavor of that memory?
I think the two things. I remember how physical, how embodied it was, right? So I was in Beirut. I took a job at AUB for a year, sort of an invited position. And I remember two things. One is how no matter what you did, that took over your life. So I lived in a building. The guardian of the building had, at some point, he had 3 people from his family arriving from Syria. Then there were 12. At some point, he had 50 people. and they were playing football with my kids in the street. I remember I would go for these early morning walk. I collected an incredible collection of political graffiti, particularly Syrian, right? And I remember these battles on the walls where somebody would put something and then somebody would come in the middle of the night and modify it. And somebody in the morning, you delete a word, you add a word, all that. So I remember the smell of the paint. Only a couple of times in a full 13 months living there and walking every day did I see actual people doing graffiti on the wall. I remember trying to take pictures in very precarious positions on the highway and almost getting rammed by cars a few times. Right? So those I remember. But what I remember even more acutely is the hope. We like to oppose any kind of analysis that exceptionalizes the Arab world. Particularly the kinds that are sort of very essentialist about the Arab world can't develop politically because of Islam or because of oil or because of, very sort of very limited analyses. But the hope that finally Arabs were entering history on their own terms in 2010 and 2011 and 2012, it still resonates with me. Like I can feel it in my body. Like I get goosebumps now talking about it to you. Right? And I think this is a feeling that will hopefully come back.
Imagine you are at an academic conference in Houston, and somebody says to you, "Oh, you study media in the Arab world? Oh, I'm not familiar with that. All I know is that there's no freedom of speech, and that speech is highly, highly, highly regulated because of political reasons." Do you find yourself wincing at that, nodding in agreement? Do you think it's a oversimplification? Is it missing the point entirely? Or is it something that is absolutely true and we just never really talk about it?
I think it's all of the above. It's a very complicated feeling, right? Because on the one level, objectively, there are facts on the ground that speech in the region is very heavily policed. But there's this thing almost like, semioticians talk about denotation and connotation. So somebody says something to you, and yes, on face value, you accept it. But what it connotes is you guys are backwards, all that. And so typically what I say, yes, freedom of speech everywhere in the world is a struggle, right? And unfortunately, I take no pleasure in saying this, the other region of the world that I'm very interested in, Latin America, the life of journalists in a country like Mexico is by far more dangerous than probably anywhere in the Arab world, right? So the idea that the first question is, yes, but it's not only the Arab world. And it's not only Latin America. It's also the US, it's also Europe. So one of the things I like to talk about is there are different forces that affect speech and its free expression and its free flow. One of them is political, another one could be economic, right? Another thing that I've discovered in very early conversations I've had some of the people running sort of the new digital native news outlets in the Arab world, the algorithm is an incredible censor, right? If you depend on Facebook, and you have a sort of a social media native news operation, you're not worried about the government calling. You're mostly worried about the algorithm burying your story in position number 1 million. Nobody sees it, right?
Yeah.
So what I say, yes, you're right, but this is one example among so many, and I give examples immediately so people don't say, "Oh, you're just saying this to deflect." So we have to acknowledge we have serious problems with media and speech in the region, but we're definitely not the only region with these problems. And there are a variety of causes and factors behind these problems everywhere in the world.
Do you find yourself more hopeful today than you have been in the past when it comes to the ability for a variety and a diversity of stories being able to be told and sort of broadcast?
This is going to sound weird because we're clearly living in very dark moments, right? violence, racism. I mean, everybody's talking about how many elections are happening around the world this year. And in most of these, the forces that are poised to win these elections are not people you want to hang out with, right? The violence, everything we're seeing nowadays, I'm still optimistic because I still feel that nobody needs the permission to narrate anymore, which is something that scholars, including Edward Said, talked about. The power to narrate now, the power to tell stories, is in a lot of people's hands. And one of the things that makes me optimistic, I'm in the business of training people to become better storytellers. That's what we do at NUQ, right? And so I am optimistic. As much as it's hard to say this, even publicly now, as much as it's hard to really feel it, on the long term, I am optimistic.
Do you feel like we produce enough journalists in the region?
I don't know. I don't have the numbers. At some point, I used to worry that we produce too many journalists and don't pay them enough. A poorly paid journalist is not a good thing for the journalist and for the society they serve, right? But also, I think we journalism in the region faces similar problems to journalism everywhere. You have a few superstars who become very chummy with the politicians and the business people they cover. They make a lot of money, but their reporting is not exactly what it should be. And then you have a few iconoclasts who stand out for what they do, the quality of the work that they do. And then you have the mass of people who move from gig to gig, who are poorly paid, who don't have health insurance, who risk their lives. Most of the times they're not credited. They're like work for hire. I think that's a big problem.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to ask you, generally, what do you think are some of the most undercovered, underappreciated storylines, beats, subjects, topics that you think people should either be exploring when it comes to our region, reading about, covering, making, fictionalized media about them, making documentary stuff, whatever it is. What do you think are some of the topics that you wish there was more coverage of?
It's a very difficult question to answer.
Sure.
So I'm going to think out loud with you.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that I would really like to see covered more, there's such emphasis on politics and geopolitics.
Yeah.
That yes, we are all political beings. We care very deeply about some political issues, but our lives don't stop at politics, or at the coverage of business. I like to see more coverage that highlights the sheer pluralism that exists in every single Arab country. I think this used to be taboo, right? Because all media laws in the Arab world, you're supposed to promote national unity and national harmony and national identity and national development. All those are words for unity that are sometimes interpreted as homogeneity, right? I'd like to see more work on non-Arabic speaking minorities in the region. This is one example. I'd like to see more work on the food. I think of myself as someone who's very well informed about food. A lot of my life revolves around food. I cook, I eat a lot, I cook a lot, right?
I've heard of your famous hot peppers.
So yesterday, to give you an example, last night or 2 nights ago, I went to the expo, the Doha Expo, right? Which is about agricultural stuff. I'll give you one example. I went to the Saudi pavilion, right? And they had 2 or 3 tasting stations serving similar sort of foods, but from different regions of the country. I heard of spices that I had never heard of before. I know this sounds very presumptuous of me. I thought, I would have heard of like what family of spices it's come from. I tasted things that I had never tasted before. I'd like more about this, right? I definitely would like to see, again, less emphasis on the big issues. I think the big issues are important. There's a lot of stuff on climate change and sustainability as a big question, and not enough on how different communities are dealing with it. I would clearly love to see more coverage of arts and culture in general, not necessarily. I think this is a distinction here. At some point, I used to walk very proudly from academic conference to the other, saying almost every Arab satellite channel has a show on poetry, which it did. That was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. We no longer have those. I wonder why, right? I think poetry has a very special resonance in the Arab world. I don't think it's necessarily a niche art. And I think there are ways in which we can promote it by having shows dedicated to it, by covering stories of poets, and that goes to the arts in general.
What do you think people most fundamentally misunderstand about what a career in media looks like? And by people, I'll say, what do you think your students misunderstand about this?
I think, I don't know what they misunderstand. I think what they're not aware of is how difficult it can be to create a reputation, right? We all gravitate towards the few media personality that are so defining of our experience with the media. That's less than 1% of people working in the media. I think the key thing to understand if you're going into a career in the media is the only stable thing to expect is constant change.
Yeah.
And that's basic skills like knowing how to write and knowing how to speak and knowing how to analyze information will serve you much better than technical mastery of the latest gizmos.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to ask you two final questions. The first is, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I would love to have met Ibn Khaldun and spent some time with him. The one place, the famous meeting that may or may not have happened outside of the gates of Damascus with the invading Mongols, that day I would love to have attended in history. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall there.
And the last question is, what are some must-read books about the region that you think that your students should all read?
I don't know, because there are so many things, and I've always been an extremely eclectic reader. I think reading some Orwell will, in the current sort of society of surveillance and algorithmic computational life that we lead, reading some Orwell would serve people well. For me, one of the things that has stimulated my imagination the most is reading some Arab poetry, with Ibn al-Muqaffa being one example, Umar bin Abi Rabi'a being another. I think those are foundational. There are a few books, Edward Said's Orientalism, I think is something that I love to think with. I disagree with a lot of what it says. I agree with a lot that it says. Maybe I should stop there. I mean, again, my mind goes all over the place when you ask this kind of question.
Marwan, this was super fun. Really, really fun talking to you.
Same here.
And I highly recommend people to definitely check out the website for the Institute for Advanced Study in the Global South at Northwestern University in Qatar. Some really cool stuff on there. Hopefully some of those events are streamable. But yeah, Marwan, really, really, really fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.